For today's discussion, the MAAT Climate Collective, comprised of TJ Demos in California, Malamo Moila in South Africa, Paulo Tavares in Brazil, and myself, Susan Schuppli, here in the UK, are joined by glaciologist Dr. Mohd Farooq Azam and artist activist Faiza Ahmad Khan, both of whom are based in India. The last time the three of us met was this past October in Kargil, Ladakh, having just returned from working at 5,000 meters at the Drang-Drung Glacier site in the Zanskar region of the Himalayas. There we carried out a scientific research and creative project focused on learning from glaciers and mountain communities called Listening to Ice. It was supported by a British Council COP26 Creative Commission. The project's broad aim is to combine scientific and artistic approaches to climate change by developing acoustic and aural methodologies in cryospheric research. Through the deployment of various situated listening practices, the project brought together technical research, local experiences, and intergenerational knowledge of glaciers together. Through a number of site-based activities, we set out to measure, monitor, and record the material transformations of the glacier, as well as engage with local mountain communities directly impacted by climate change and glacial recession. Scientific activities included the deployment of an underwater sensor or hydrophone at the glacial lake, setting up both a GPS and meteorological weather station, as well as installing a series of bamboo stakes along a 15-kilometer stretch into the ablation area of the glacier to measure annual changes in its mass balance. Workshops brought local villagers to the glacier for sessions in deep listening. Lowering various hydrophones into its icy crevices allowed us to tune into its sub-glacial streams, to hear the rushing of meltwater and the underwater crackling of ice and popping of air bubbles. For some, the glacier conjured the domesticated sound of boiling tea, for others, the whir of a passing helicopter. Our guests for today's conversation are my collaborators. Dr. Mohd Farooq Azam is an earth scientist working on glaciology, hydrology, and climate change in the Himalayas. He brings more than a decade of field experience and remote sensing knowledge to the project. Azam's research focuses on measuring and monitoring the impacts of global warming on Himalayan glaciers. He's worked extensively on the Chotashigiri Glacier in the western Himalayas and published the landmark study demonstrating that this glacier is the benchmark for understanding ice loss across the entire range. He completed his PhD in France while working with local communities on Himalayan glaciers. Azam's current research focuses on Drang-Drung Glacier, a site not yet investigated. So our presence there was really the start of a much long-term research project. Comparing the most studied glacier in the Himalayas with one that has never been examined provides a useful analytic framework. As co-applicant, Azam took a lead in developing our scientific experiments, organizing our expedition, as well as engaging actively in capacity building with his students and local knowledge sharing. He is assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology, Indore. Faiza Ahmad Khan is an award-winning filmmaker and researcher now based in Goa, who has been working on the Learning from Ice project with me for quite some time, and this one also includes future planned work together in Nunavut in the Canadian Arctic next summer. For Listening to Ice, Khan assumed the role of community project coordinator, focusing in particular on community-based initiatives such as the Deep Listening to Glaciers workshop. Faiza is also a member of the Border Ecologies Network here in the UK, and like Paulo Tavares, completed her MA in our program in the Center for Research Architecture. So Faiza and I have a much longer kind of history that predates our work together around glaciers. We were also actually joined by a local NGO and grassroots organization called Local Futures. So Jigmeet Singh and Gunsang Deakin joined us both to assist with all of the activities and acted as also as our translators, translated in particular from Ladakhi into English. And Gurmeet Sapal, an independent filmmaker and cinematographer, also joined the team. And he normally works as a freelance documentary maker for Al Jazeera and had joined us, having recently made a short film on the widows of Everest at base camp for Al Jazeera. So those were the members of our sort of core team. And then, of course, there were a lot of PhD students who joined us, a local teacher from Ladakh, porters, Adhikari from Nepal. So in the end, we were 21 people working at the glacier site. So just to reiterate, I'm really grateful for this opportunity, given that we haven't been back that long. It's only early December, and this expedition took place in September, October. So this conversation is also the first time that the team has regrouped and gives us an opportunity to reflect a little bit on those experiences that we had together. So the plan is to review some of the visual materials for about 10-15 minutes so that the Climate Collective has a sense of the kind of broader context and the sort of range and diversity of tasks that we were engaged with. But before doing that, I thought I would like to invite you, Farooq, to say a few words about the context of climate change in the Himalayas, and in particular what you feel are the kind of challenges that are faced both in the field, in the work that you do, but also by the communities whose entire life worlds are reliant on the Himalayas, in particular for sources of water.
Thank you, Susan. So we understand all these global warming happening everywhere, and there are lots of proofs about that. So almost all the ecosystem, they are disturbed because of global warming, and so as the Himalayan glaciers. So this ecosystem actually lying at very high altitude, and if we want to understand the impact of climate change, then we have to go at those altitudes. We have to monitor the meteorological conditions, and we have to observe the glaciers. So in general, lots of work has been done through satellites, but there are still some studies on ground where scientists are going on the glaciers, installing some stations at very high altitudes. And in general, because of global warming, the glaciers of Himalaya, they are losing their mass, they are receding. And this actually becomes very important in the Himalayan range, because the rivers coming from the Himalayan glaciers, like Indus, Ganges, and Brahmaputra, they have significant amount of meltwater from Sunan glaciers. So any change in the climate, so that is going to affect those runoffs coming from those glaciers. And because this is the Indus Basin specifically, it is the most fertile land on earth. So lots of agricultural activities are happening there. So any change in the runoff will affecting already the agricultural activities there. Also, lots of hydropower generation plants are there. So those are also going to be affected soon. And water is also being used at locally scale by villages for their agriculture purposes, as well as local, daily municipal requirements for daily uses. And it is also very fragile because, we are also sharing water from the neighboring countries. So any change happening in these river runoffs will also, may affect basically the international relationships with neighboring countries. So overall, there is no doubt that Himalayan glaciers are wasting, but there was some hype something like 10 years ago after the IPCC event that suggested that the glaciers will be gone very soon from the Himalayas. So now we understand mainly from the remote sensing estimates that the glaciers, they are losing their mass. though the vestige is heterogeneous along the Himalayan range. And some studies also suggest that the glaciers in the Himalaya, they are losing similar to the other glaciers around the world. So there is no doubt that the glaciers are, are losing their mass. And obviously there are some, effects which we are actually already witnessing. And there will be worse effects in the coming future because of the changes in the runoff patterns about seasonality as well as volumes in these rivers. So I think uh, that's all about this.
Great. No, thank you. Yeah, it's important just to situate the what we're going to sort of see in the clips. So these clips, I'm going to move through aspects of the website, and I'm also going to make that website available to MAAT so people online can then explore things more fully. Let me screen share. The project Listening to Ice is trying to understand the phenomena and the condition of climate change through the acoustic register. We're in this extraordinary environment here in northern India at the Drang-Drung Glacier. So what we're going to try and do this afternoon is use our hydrophones to find the most acoustically dynamic and lively parts of the lake, which will give us some indication as to the activity and the behavior of the glacier, which of course is undergoing kind of rapid transformations because of climate change and global warming. So Farooq, I think we need to paddle closer to the snout of the glacier and just really get a sense of where it's going to be most kind of promising. And you were saying that at this time of year there's probably less calving events, but I still think it's worth trying to see whether we can somehow capture some of those acoustic phenomena, even if it's maybe just the crackling of underwater ice or something like that. I don't know. What do you think?
So we were there at the hump actually, having some big boulders. Yeah, it was a good experience to go by kayak there. Anyway, means the idea is to take that route and then cross the glacier and then reach this site.
Yeah, I can hear dripping and then I can hear some grinding.
So that grinding is actually, I think, the ice melting.
Really?
Yeah, because I don't think it's a very dynamic area, having some friction between ice layers. Yeah, the middle is stopped. Yeah, okay. So it has stopped. Okay. Now start.
So do, yeah.
Start. So red light, and then we should have green. Yeah, so it's logging the data now. Okay. So we can close the shell. All right.
The chafing.
Oh, it's giving some buoyancy. It's heavy, but it's giving some buoyancy. Yeah.
For me, it was already quite incredible to hear the sound of the water, and then when we were paddling, even that was you could hear it really distinctly. Yeah. On there, you could hear pops and like some kind of grinding. I don't know, maybe I was imagining, but I was hearing channels of water. That was really incredible. Normally we privilege sight over sound, but to reverse that and to focus on the hearing. Yeah. And I wasn't actually really looking at the ice so much as I was trying to listen to it.
Still now I feel like floating in the water. 자꾸 그러죠. 아주 스카드가 좀 좋대요.
Listening to eyes.
So I hope those materials give a sort of broad sense of the kind of range of activities that we are engaged with, and I encourage everybody to, if you're interested, feel free to explore the kind of website to look at the ways in which we're also trying to develop a sonic methodology to link these activities together. So, for example, in the section geology, we had met a geologist also in Leh Ladakh, who was playing music using the different mineral content of various sort of rocks. So sound was really, I think, a very kind of like productive way to create kind of unexpected connections between contexts and situations. In terms of opening up the discussion now, moving to that phase, I wanted to maybe direct a question first to Faiza, and then to bring you into the conversation through your own experience and interest in knowledge sharing, Faiza, and then we just open up to everybody, if that's okay. So I wanted to begin by suggesting that science could perhaps be understood or positioned as producing the conditions of hospitality, whereby non-experts and locals might be invited into the process to get a sense of what's at stake in scientific work. I say this in recognition of the fact that knowledge sharing between communities of concern, whether they're scientific or social, is still quite limited in its scope. And I wonder whether you have any thoughts on this provocation to think and do science from a condition of hospitality. And when I say hospitality, it's really in the sense of welcoming or opening up our home. So, for example, the home that was the glacial field site. And I really felt that our approach at Drang-Drung captures something of this condition of hospitality. And certainly when we went to the village of Aksho, there was a strong sense of conviviality and welcomeness on the part of local villages who invited us into their homes and fed us and housed us. And so I think if we think about hospitality as a mode of sharing, then to share the planet with others, including plants and animals, means always to be acting from sort of simultaneously the position of the host and the guest. So with maybe those few thoughts, Faiza, I wondered whether you had any kind of reflections from your specific kind of vantage point and experiences.
Yeah, I think I'll start by mentioning that we actually met Farooq for the first time when we got to the glacier or to Kargil. And we came across Farooq's work online during the lockdown, actually. And what invited us to reach out was something that Farooq had said in one of his interviews, which was that he was interested in bringing science and society closer, and was interested in community engagement. And that's something that was kind of developing in our framework as well. And I think this idea of inviting the local community into the scientific practice was to develop, let's say, these modes of listening better by listening to people who have a different relationship with the environment. And the workshop was kind of one way to do that, because we were using different technology. We were using these scientific instruments and sensors and audio and video technology. But I think who was listening was also quite key. And so to invite these women from the village, and I think during the workshop, they were making these associations of, the sounds being like the sound of the kettle or the helicopter, which I think at this point was more at the level of association, and more sustained engagements would probably make meaning more productive. And so I feel like that was a start, but these processes need to be sustained, so that we have a more kind of richer polyphonic understanding of what is going on.
Thanks, Faiza. Farooq, did you want to jump in, or anyone? Feel free. As is our habit with the Climate Collective discussions, they're very broad-ranging and quite organic. So anyone who wishes to respond or say something is absolutely welcome to do so. But Farooq, I don't know whether this notion of that hospitality and the ways that Faiza's talked about, how do we develop long-term engagements that move from this kind of like experience of the workshop to something that's more sustainable and etc.
So yeah, I think specifically about the Himalayan cryosphere and climate change. So if we want to somehow reduce the effect of global warming, so we have to communicate with the local societies. We have to communicate with the population. And I think if we explain them how, some of them actually they are experiencing already, who are very close to the glaciers, but many people who are downstream, they don't understand actually what is happening up there and how important is this. So everybody is emitting some black carbon. So whatever we are doing, we are emitting black carbon. And if we have to, or we want to limit the global warming to some limit, to some certain, like 1.5 degree target we have actually. So we have to educate people so that in every daily activity, they can try to reduce their carbon footprint. And bringing science to these population, including the local population, is very important, because if they understand the importance of this, for instance, the amount wise, if we talk the volumetrically, how important, though it is a very small amount actually, the water coming from the glacier and snow, but because of its seasonality, like one mentioned in your audio clip. So that is very important. If we have the water right time at right place, that can be used for agriculture. For instance, you discussed the case of Ladakh. So if we can educate people with these things, then perhaps everybody will be aware, and everybody will put some efforts to reduce the black carbon impact or black carbon footprint. So I think that is where we need to link science with society.
To jump in, I don't know, just to pick up on that, maybe someone from outside the project, also in a kind of external viewing this material for the first time. And thank you so much for sharing. Super powerful. And I'm very curious how you guys are going to develop in the very different dimensions that this project has, from science to arts to forms of local knowledge. And maybe maybe there's two questions that that the introduction makes me think of. The first one, I think, connects to what Faiza was saying. I'm not sure if I'm completely right, but this idea of who was listening. to the melting glacier, right? And perhaps this idea of who is listening also implies forms of local knowledge and forms of understanding and seeing and hearing, the ways in which the glacier is changing, that are as valuable as hard science or IPCC types of science. So I think that kind of discussion is super important today, both in how we understand climate change and global warming, but also how we sort of think about solutions. So this is something that I would like to ask, this idea of how other forms of knowledge that are totally kind of rooted, embodied in the land itself can play a role in the project. But my first question was, and this is kind of more general, and something that we have been discussing a lot in the climate collectives, is the way in which one of the main questions of climate change and global warming is how to make it sensible to a wider public and also to politicians, leaderships and things like that, and what kind of evidentiary materials one can use to make it sensible. And of course that this relies a lot on the type of data that is used by hard science, natural science, which most of the time can look very opaque or difficult to understand to the general public, right? So there is a way in which those data should be translated, or how they appear to the public, how they are exposed, is something that completely it's kind of fundamental. Because it has the ability, so to say, to mobilize hearts and minds for us to understand what it means, glacier loss and the loss of its wildlife and things like that. And in that sense, I think one could even think about, a kind of genealogy of the imaginary or the image of climate change, wherein glaciers or glacier loss plays a sort of central role. Right? One of the ways to communicate that the climate of the planet is changing has been very much to show images of glaciers that are melting, or, before and after image, or image of wildlife in those, in those kind of glacier areas or icy areas, that relies a lot on the visuals, right? Either by, kind of documentary photographs or satellite images where you can see those glaciers shrinking. And there is something about the project, of course, I think it's at the heart of the project, which is not, and Faiza addressed this in her interview, which is kind of changing from the site to, the aural. And this is very interesting to me, because I did recently a podcast with an artist, ecoacoustics artist called David Monac. And Dave, what he's doing is, I don't know if I shared with the Climate Collective before, but just to give a bit of context, what he's doing is, setting up microphones in wild forest areas that has had like little impacts from extractivism and, and industries and things like that, in order to capture the aural or the audio footprint of what is a very complex biodiverse system. And he showed us some of these records, and it's kind of amazing, the sound of the forest, because it's really noisy. It's really like full body of sound. And what he says is that we are losing this sound that we don't even know. It's something that we are listening now, hearing now, but we are losing the sound footprint. And he calls it, I think, sound footprints of extinction, because he's making an archive of a type of orchestra, so to speak, that we are losing with climate change, right? That those spaces, those sounds will never exist anymore. So this is a kind of long introduction for a very simple question. What the ice is telling us, what do we hear from ice, and why we need to listen to ice?
So, yeah, actually, ice is basically what is happening if there is no climate change. So every year we have some snow accumulation on the glaciers, and every year during summers we have some ablation or melting. So there is a balance, means we are getting some input and we are losing some output. So if the climate change is not happening, everything is like uniform. So this input and output, they are roughly same. And they may change slightly because of, slight changes in meteorological condition over a specific year. But what is happening now, because we have imbalance in glacier ice. So whatever we are getting from annual snow accumulation, we are losing much more than this. So the glaciers, they are losing their mass. And that is happening because of continuously increasing temperatures, or you can say the global warming. So this is specifically happening over last 150 years. However, there are some episodes, because these glaciers, they are also, kind of, they can try to make a balance in, in a changed climate system, but with a smaller size. For instance, if climate change is happening, so the glacier is always trying to make, cope up with the climate change, and it's trying to achieve a new equilibrium state or the balance state, but that is at the cost of some mass wastage. So mass wastage is happening.
And if I might add, oh, sorry, did you want to address the why listen to ice?
Yeah, so actually, I think you can put more light, but I can try. So basically, what in the Himalayan system, actually, we have very several challenges when we go to observe those glaciers, and the problem is we have very low oxygen. We need lots of manpower. We need lots of money for this. So we need big projects, because we are going to spend lots of days there. So there are some kind of challenges in the observations of Himalayan glaciers. And we heard, actually, Susan introduced this to me. Some scientists, they are trying to decode the melting of ice by listening their noises. So if there is some ice is just breaking off from the glacier main trunk or snout, you can say, so that is dropping in the water and it's making some sound. When ice is melting, it is also because when ice was developed some hundreds years ago, so there was some in this process some air is trapped. So when it is melting now, so that air is being released and making some noise. So some scientists, they are trying to understand the melting patterns of glaciers by listening them. And we just thought, okay, let's try to explore if we can get something, some kind of clue from their noises, maybe some kind of melting pattern. So that is kind of just we have just initiated for the first time in the Himalaya, and we have collected some data. And during the first expedition, I think the idea was to just get some sort of experience. And now we have some experience, and we are planning to install that sensor, actually, next year in some lake, which is having some kind of exposed terminus. So that may be providing some sporadic blocks sporadically to the shedding off from the glacier and falling in the lake. So this is one part of the listening of the ice. So we have just started, and we don't know exactly how where we will reach, actually. So maybe we will be able to get something out of it, or maybe just kind of a try application where we are just trying to because normally in glaciers in like Svalbard, they are big glacier, they are terminating in the ocean, and lots of big ice chunks, they are breaking off from the main trunk and falling. So that is the main work which has been done by other scientists. So this is one side of the project. And others was because when we were talking and developing this project, so other side was also to listen the local communities. So that is how it became like listening to the ice and local communities or glacial communities, basically. So I think Faiza and Susan can put more light about those listenings.
It is really, Yeah. I was just going to say, and then, yeah, I'll be very, very brief, but to say that the listening offers a way to monitor in sort of real-time patterns of glacial dynamics, and then you could develop, in India, one of the big problems is flood burst events from the lakes that are at the terminus of glaciers, then flooding and then impacting on communities that would be downstream, which would be very different than the, say, glaciers that are breaking off in the Antarctic region, for example. So it's the proximity of local villages to the glacier, and the acoustic sensors can help you establish a kind of pattern of behavior that's very highly grained in terms of its resolution. And you could see the kind of, in principle, at least the way that I understand it from the scientists at Scripps who sort of pioneered it, is you start to develop an acoustic signature for each glacier that you monitor, and to really start to understand those, the pattern of behavior, and in some way then possibly one could use it in a kind of preemptive way to understand what might be an imminent risk to communities that are living in proximity to these glaciers. So that's how it works within the sort of scientific kind of milieu, which is different than listening within sort of cultural context, which was another part of the project, of course. But TJ? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I wanted to follow up on that. Farooq mentioned, and one of the last things he said, listening to communities as well. So I'm curious, on the one hand, there's the bioacoustic ecology scientific technology that you're introducing into this area, which has yielded all sorts of really interesting and important scientific insights into glacial melting. And I'm also wondering what kind of input communities in the region have had, and if we can extend a little more agency to them, like what did they bring to the project? I imagine because they're living already in the shadow of these glaciers, they have their own local knowledges and approaches and listening habits to what's going on already. So I'm curious, how did the bioacoustic ecology experiment open up new pathways for more pathways that are going in both directions rather than just simply from the technology and science to the communities. And I would also suspect that these communities, Farooq mentioned their carbon footprint, but I would think that they would be pretty like minor and minuscule in terms of the kind of climate change causality that they're bringing to glacial melt compared to, for instance, fossil capital and corporate globalization. So I'm curious about that as well, like how they understand this and what kind of political agency also they might develop in part because of projects like this that focus on science as hospitality, or also maybe if there's a component of this in terms of how science might connect to climate, community-based climate transformation. If there's a political element or a justice element in relationship to the science that you're doing. Maybe that's a question for Faiza, I don't know, but thank you.
Yeah, I have a couple of responses. One is that from our interaction with Mohd Namgyal, the song collector, he had this very rich archive of songs which spoke of people's relationship to glaciers, to ice, to the mountains, and so obviously indicated a very kind of a deep connection with their local environment, and they kind of ranged from practices of growing glaciers, agricultural practices, how water is to be shared. All of that. But what was also interesting was that when we were in Aksho village and we were asking local people if they had, if they knew some of these songs or if there were rituals that they practiced around glaciers, very few people seem to know. And so I think one question that we had in relation to this archive of music was that it obviously indicates a relationship that people have, but with the changing climate, that relationship is changing, and so how is that manifesting in sort of these cultural artifacts, if there are new ways that we're new stories that we're hearing, what kind of occupational relationships do people have now. These were just some of the questions that we had from that archive. And just another thing that I kind of was thinking of when Susan, you spoke about this idea of hospitality and being guests, kind of looking at ourselves and non-humans as guests. I think one thing that we were hearing a lot wherever we went in Ladakh was stories of bears, and how bears are kind of invading human camps and villages. And so I think if you kind of see that as like these new folk stories, and try and understand and unpack why these bears are there. We got told that because the winter has reduced, and so the bears need more sustenance, and therefore they come into the villages, for example. And so I feel like maybe we need to also develop new ways to sense and new stories and songs.
Faiza, I think that's a great example, because I think when we are what we might call like knowledge of climate change or knowledge of environmental transformations, or even just knowledge of environmental systems, which of course is captured in songs, but the songs deal with harvest, with planting, with the cyclical nature of life. That's environmental knowledge, but it's not framed like environmental knowledge. But that's of course intrinsically what it is. So in some ways it's about, I think, and as you said, then that story of the bears it was kind of really repeated, is to understand that story that is very present in everybody's imagination and experience, and is very immediate. The reason, as you said, for the appearance of the bear actually can tell us something of these sort of changes. So it's not that it's not that there would be like specifically knowledge that's that is going. The new myths aren't always necessarily about environmental change. The new myths might actually be part of that, those kinds of changes, and it's like, how do you generate understandings of those changes and connect the dots? And I think I think that was a kind of great example in that way. And maybe just to add that when Faiza and I were talking to the person who runs the Snow Leopard Conservancy program, and he goes, he made this comment about how that they were distributing cameras to local villages in the Himalayas, but the people weren't doing much with them, and they weren't really taking images, and they wanted to turn sort of to work with villagers to be these sort of climate change reporters. And it's like, but why would people feel any sense of like agency or urgency to take these cameras into the field and do this documentation? It's not enough for an NGO just to hand cameras to local villages and then ask people to document change according to a format that's in some way coming from elsewhere. So I think it's about how to, maybe for the project, how do we listen to the practices that are already part of community life that might be really kind of rich repositories of knowledge of environmental change, without always saying, okay, now we're going like here's the technologies that we're using, and it'd be if you could use them too. Even though I am very committed to science as opening up opportunities for, as I said, for hospitality, but I also understand TJ's question is about much more about the sort of reciprocity and a sense of kind of agency. But Malemo, I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to this conversation.
I do. I have a bit of a curiosity. I was going through the website earlier, which I really enjoyed. So thank you, everybody. And there was this word that really stuck out for me, which was expedition.
Yeah.
And I think because it's kind of foreign to me at one level, but also because obviously my association with it is very much with discovery and pioneer and explorer, I think, and the kind of colonial frameworks of that. And I mean, being in the Himalayas, it's a very specific kind of context of kind of white male expedition and discovery. As a kind of side note, I recently learned about an art project in Germany, which is exploring the fact that the first discoverer of Kilimanjaro, being the first white man at the top of Kilimanjaro, actually attempted to lob off the peak. And he took half of it and gave it to the German king and sold the other half. This is like this kind of madness, you know, of this kind of exploration, expedition kind of culture. And there's also been a long history of artists in kind of in tandem with a lot of this work in kind of colonial, particularly colonial practice. And so my question, I think, is a bit about the way you're choosing to practice within this history of kind of science and artistic practice and expedition. And I see already a kind of play, I suppose, with these ideas, you know, instead of a kind of, you know, instead of a conquering or a kind of a discovering, it's about sensing and a listening. It's a very different kind of approach to this history. And I think, Faiza, you were already sort of speaking to the need for this polyphonic and more sustained process, which really brings a very different kind of sensitivity. But I'm interested to just kind of to hear how you think about being artists in these spaces, working with scientific material and this kind of the kinds of choices that you make around practice, if that makes sense.
I mean, yes and no. Because Farooq is a scientist. He's not an artist making those kind of decisions. So the expedition is what they call these kind of journeys. I might not call it an expedition myself, but that's the term that's used within the scientific framework that Farooq is working in. And certainly, I mean, I can't speak for the specific context there, but the expeditionary imaginary is very prominent within the Arctic region because the quest for the poles is completely this specific kinds of imaginary. But Farooq, I guess you could say something. I presumably that's the standard technical term that is used. And I don't know whether you have any specific kind of insights into the sort of more kind of colonial histories, because certainly when Faiza and I were doing research over the past few years, I mean, there's a lot of archives from sort of British expeditions and also German into the Himalayas, certainly, but that's of a different kind of, that's a very different kind of like expeditionary sort of imaginary, but I'd be curious to know, why that, I mean, what your insights into that sort of, those histories of the kind of colonial conquest of Himalayas, whether that has, does that echo at all in your own work, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just to clarify, just kind of interesting thinking about this very, within this kind of long durée of forms of engaging with nature in scientific and artistic forms, kind of how how we make decisions to operate differently, I think is really interesting, and it's clear you're already thinking through a number of ways of doing that.
I think, yes, there were some expeditions and by Britishers and some other people as well in the Himalayas more than 150 years ago, actually. So artists also went there. They just went and they painted or drew some mountain ranges like Gangotri glaciers. We have lots of paintings about Gangotri Glacier because that has been very religious place, for Hindus, and because they were also adventurers, right? So they used to go to explore the mountains not only for arts but for their own adventure. And lately, I think around 100 years ago, Britishers, when they were in India, so they also established Geological Survey of India. So in this Geological Survey of India organization, there were so many expeditions organized in different mountain ranges in the whole Himalaya, from let's say from western to eastern part. And the idea was, because that was scientific organization, so the idea was to map the glaciers, and the idea was to map the area, the mountains actually, the height. And there were so many expeditions, and those documents we still have actually. So in fact, I used lots of reports developed by Geological Survey of India, over especially in 1950s and 60s, in order to understand how the glaciers, they have changed from that time to present time. So yes, there was lots of expeditions, I would say expeditions, but of course at that time, if some artist is going, so they would consider it like a journey. So for scientific point of view, we always prefer, yeah, of course it's a journey, but it's kind of, we are going with some goals actually to fulfill those goals. We are not going only to explore the area. So for us, it's expedition.
Mm-hmm. And I think another thing that's really important to signal would be, and it was in the project sort of brief as well, was and you've pointed to that, the sort of the knowledge infrastructures that the colonial empire set up globally, including all of these like research institutes, etc., in India. So the provocation for me is how to decolonize what was called here in Britain pink ice, meaning the areas of the world that were part of the Commonwealth, in which the Commonwealth, the colors of the Commonwealth on the map are always pink, and so there's term pink ice emerged. And so it's something that I've been asking myself, like in the background of all of this work, in particular, like, and with respect to this project, what would how would one decolonize this sort of pink ice? And it's and I don't know what the answer to that is, but I do connect to the point that you just made about the sort of repurposing these kind of colonial archives for contemporary understandings. And the same is happening in Canada with all of these geological surveys that happened in the 19th century in the Rocky Mountains in particular. And there's a really interesting project trying to monitor glacial change, and so has gone back into these archives because they actually are they actually contain useful knowledge from the point of view of a kind of study of comparison, but also, I mean, who is now studying in these universities and these knowledge infrastructures? Who's doing the kind of research, the field research, etc.? There's a big shift taking place, and I think that's why your work for me is really important. It's not a group of scientists traveling from Germany to go and work on the Himalayas. It's you working there with your small group of students and a local teacher from Ladakh. I think it's a very different kind of constituency and community of scientific practitioners as well in this case. Yeah, so I think it's that's I think a really important kind of dimension, but it's like but anyway, as I said, this sort of like provocation of decolonizing ice, I think is really important. But I felt it actually more strongly when I was in Svalbard, that has such a kind of pervasive tourist economy set up around the kind of Arctic and bringing tourists into this very, very remote kind of environment where you're completely you're completely divorced from spaces of human habitation, etc. So when we are in Drang-Drung and in Zanskar, there's a much closer proximity and working relationship, or closer proximity to local communities. That's quite different than the sort of like imaginary of the north that is really happening in like these tourist economies, as I said, of like more of the kind of Arctic regions, in fact, yeah. But I don't know, Faiza, if you wanted to add anything or anyone else, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was thinking how Ladakh and some of these conversations around melting glaciers kind of feature Ladakh, and it seems to be at or like the Himalayas, and they seem to be, you know, at the heart of this climate emergency. But I haven't spent that much time in Ladakh, but I've been a few times, and it's always been to actually work with people who are who are kind of exploring alternatives to development issues, and so, you know, alternative forms of medicine, for example, or farming, water sharing practices. And so Ladakh, for me, always kind of had this imagination of possibilities rather than crisis. Yeah. And I mean, just separately, I think if you had to see us getting to the site of the glacier to camp, you would not call it an expedition, because we were like rolling and tumbling down the side of this mountain, and I think and our adventures on the glacier was basically this fun day that we spent with these women, listening to the glacier and kind of enjoying our day out there. So yeah,
some of those videos are really funny. They're really good.
Yeah, there was a high degree of heroism operating anywhere. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask, just to switch gears a little bit, but to think about more what Faiza mentioned, climate emergency. You know, it seems like if we're listening to glaciers, something that we're hearing is, from what I understand, is a likely post-glacial future. And given the fact that you know, the Himalayas are so important for water sources in terms of the, you know, filling the Brahmaputra and Ganges rivers, the Yamuna is connected in Delhi. Millions and millions of people depend on this for their water sources. So I'm wondering, in terms of what the Climate Collective is trying to, one of the things that we're trying to do with our programming is to think about how emergency can give way to the emergence of new practices, new ways of addressing these kind of crises. I'm wondering, like, what maybe for Farooq, what do you see in terms of a post-glacial future? What does that look like if we're listening closely? What do you expect will happen? How can we mitigate this and adapt to that that kind of post-glacial eventuality?
Yeah, so yeah, as I said, the glaciers' behavior along the Himalayan range is different, actually. For instance, the glaciers, or we can say the rivers in you know, Ganga and Brahmaputra basins. So these rivers, actually, they are getting most of their water from the monsoonal rains. So basically, if we see the meltwater contribution from glacier is just 1% to 5% actually at the in these river basins. So if we see the climate change, if we just as imagine the post-glacial era, and we will see there won't be much impact in the Ganga and Brahmaputra. However, during this process, when this deglaciation is happening, at very rapid pace, so basically we may have actually lots of disasters related to the heavy rains and heavy melting, related to some glacial lake outburst floods. So this is the situation in the Brahmaputra and Ganga basins. If we move to west in the Indus basin, so the picture is very complicated there. So some of the glaciers, for instance, in Western Himalaya, they are losing mass, and some other glaciers in extreme northwest over the Karakoram range. So those glaciers, they are almost in balanced state over last 50 years. So that is a very complicated picture, which is coming from west part over in this. So in this, if we see right now, the estimates we have about up to 40% water is coming from glacial meltwater and snow meltwater. So if there is no glacier actually, so the seasonality, which is very important for the agriculture, especially, so that will change completely, because we won't be having this kind of dynamic system at some point over winters, because this area is getting lots of snow over winters, and in winters we don't need much water, but we need water in early summer and during the summer. So if this balance or this dynamics is disturbed, we don't have, for instance, any glacier, so the agricultural field or the agricultural sector will be affected hugely. Also, the electricity sector will be affected. So this post-glacial period or era will impact differently over different ranges in the Himalaya. Now, if we say about the adaptive measures, actually, so there is a challenge about that too, because like if we compare the glaciology or the cryospheric science history understanding, it's not very old from the Himalayan range, because the first observation was started in 1974, September, by Geological Survey of India. And it's still because of challenges about the high altitude and associated expedition cost. So we don't have so many glaciers observed in the Himalaya. For instance, the glaciers we have observations. So those glaciers are very small, easy to access glacier, and such glaciers, they are kind of rapid response type glaciers. So this was perhaps the reason some couple of decades ago, when we had these observations from small glaciers, scientists, they thought that all the glaciers are behaving similarly. But the big glaciers, they are kind of they can tolerate bigger impact of climate change actually, and their response time is much longer than smaller glaciers. So maybe the climate change or the change in meteorological conditions happening today will be shown after a decade, after maybe 5 decades, through their dynamics in big glaciers. So the challenge is to understand exactly how these glaciers are behaving towards climate change. Because small glaciers, then we also have some glaciers which are covered by debris. So they have different kind of behavior towards climate change. And some large glaciers, they behave differently, similarly, depending on the climate itself. Because as I said, in Ganga and Brahmaputra, the climate is monsoon dominated. While in this area, we have the climate which is mainly governed by western disturbances. So the precipitation is coming during winters. So we have lots of challenges actually in order to understand how the glaciers are behaving in different different ranges. And globally, if I say, the only solution we have, that is first, of course, if there are some disasters actually. So if we have some kind of early warning system, maybe in future we will be able to develop something because of, through these acoustic sensors. I don't know, but we are trying actually, as Susan mentioned. But if we have some early warning systems, maybe we can have some adaptive measures for possible future glacier lake outburst floods, which are happening actually in the whole Himalaya. But in long term, actually, the only solution is to cut the black carbon, limit the global warming. And of course, some countries which are already developed, they have infrastructure, everything is developed. So for those, maybe it's a bit easy to limit the black carbon emission. But for those countries who, is still under development, actually, so it's very difficult for them actually to cut this black carbon. And of course, the solution should be, should come from some alternatives, like we can have some, solar power. We can have some other solutions. So the countries, I think globally, what I understand, the countries which are developed, they have some alternatives. So they should share that the knowledge or engineering they have developed for clean energy, so that should be shared with the countries which are just developing or under development or poorly developed, so that the black carbon emission can be can be kept in limit, because any country emitting anywhere, so it's global circulation, so everything goes everywhere actually. So I think that is a solution in long term. We need to limit the black carbon emission.
That maybe we should mention, Susan, that email that we got from British Council to say that all of this material will be hosted on a platform by Reliance, which is essentially a petrochemical company that made its money in petrochemicals. And then now they want to support this creative commission at COP26. And
that's a very good point, Faiza, because the Climate Collective take place in the Museum of Architecture and Technology.
Yeah. Paolo, just to say that Faiza brought that to forward and was really I guess upset about hearing about this, and so then I brought it to the British Council, and so they canceled that contract with Geo. So that was like a big win for like activists like Faiza, because Geo is this major it's the Netflix of India basically. So yeah, well done, Faiza, but that's a rare kind of like win in the face of these kinds of entanglements. But go ahead, Paolo.
No, yeah, I wonder how this is part of the project, because more and more, and we discussed this a lot with the Climate Collective, because the Climate Collective also takes place in a museum in Portugal, in Porto. I don't know if it's Porto or Lisbon, right? It's the Museum of Art and Technology, and the main sponsor, one of the main sponsors of the museum is an oil company. And and there was many discussions with, of course, in relation to TJ's practice, very much grounded on a kind of political ecology through curating and writing and things like that, and myself as well, in terms of the sort of land activism or environmental activism that is involved in my practice, and all of us, Molemo and also Susan, and how we were taking part on a cultural project that somehow tries to wash out, greenwash, the very sort of effects of those industries. And we discuss this a lot, and maybe we don't have time to discuss this too much here because our time is gone, but it's interesting to see how, the cultural industry became a kind of battlefront for kind of bringing awareness of these complicities between culture and extractive industries, and how art is sort of playing a role on that. So it's interesting to hear about that you guys brought this forward, and that there was a kind of reaction, and maybe there is a way in which this is also, as I see, is also part of the project and the agency of the project, not only locally, but also in the kind of cultural sphere where it takes place. And but my question, I don't know if it's a question, it's a comment, and I don't know if it's really pertinent, if it's valuable. But first of all, in terms of the expedition that Molemo, the question that she rose up, how this kind of practice of going somewhere and doing science somehow has a kind of history, a kind of colonial imperial history that's willing or not, we cannot let it go because it's part of this mode of engagement. But that's why for me the archive becomes important, specifically the sound archives, the collecting of those sounds archives, because you start to see them. And in the bear story, I was very much interested in the bear story and how people are kind of renegotiating that folk stories to kind of make sense of how the forces of the present are happening. Lots of indigenous groups in South America, the kind of mythology that they through which they interpret the world, of course, they changed a lot, right? Because they try to kind of make sense of the new threats to their survival through their own mythology. So if you hear, for example, shaman and intellectual of the Yanomamo people, Davi Kopenawa, he wrote a kind of massive book. And for him, he always interprets kind of, the ecological crisis, the sky is falling. He always has this metaphor that the sky is falling down, and, the trees are that which hold the sky together. And he tries to he offers us an interpretation of, the ecological crisis through a kind of reconfiguration of their own stories and methodologies and mythologies. And in that sense, I think that archive is important, because also for the guys who did the expeditions in, the white sort of imperialists, they were kind of harvesting those knowledge very much from local people. Right. It was not that they came and nobody knew nothing about, those lands, and, they were sort of making this in dialogue, but finally they put in a museum and say this was knowledge produced under empire. But in fact, it was something that was extracted already. So again, I think that's why the archive becomes so important to me. And I was very much interested in this kind of collections of songs that embody these types of knowledge.
Having these conversations with various scientists in India over the course of the sort of pandemic and kind of lockdown, but it was, and I think Farooq, you've pointed to that, there's relatively a kind of paucity of, or in a very limited knowledge really about the Himalayas, surprisingly, and India is very active in Antarctica, and this in some way also connects to TJ's point about emergency, because the research and development that's happening in Antarctica and is really being entirely driven by the Mars mission and so like the mission to Mars, and of course India also has a probe, the Mangalam probe, that has entered into the orbit of Mars, but the degree to which finance, resourcing, expertise in Antarctica is using Antarctica as a proxy for the Mars mission, because of Mars being this repository of frozen water, etc. So drilling technology is being adapted and tested. And so time and time again, scientists would talk about how Mars is actually this important player in NASA's work and in the American work in Antarctica. And even as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Farooq, that a lot of scientists in India have actually worked in Antarctica and have never worked in the Himalayas. So the sort of glaciology research, has a very strong basis in the history of glaciology in India has a very strong basis in doing work in Antarctica, in fact. And then we have that, obviously, when we think about the work, contemporary work in Antarctica, and the sort of Mars mission is completely part of this imaginary of crisis and of colonizing other kind of worlds, etc. And yet the sort of mountains of the Himalayas are relatively little known and sort of studied. So, I mean, there's also these kind of really, these other relationships sort of that are part of that sort of bigger story, if you will. And so, anyway, I found that kind of fascinating. And also, of course, the Gondwana plate that broke off from Antarctica that actually is India and is the tectonic force that eventually would produce the Himalayas. So there are this sort of geological connections, of course, but that's story for another kind of time. But the history of glaciology in India has this very interesting dimension to its to the work that's happened. Faiza?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say this is something I learned last week, but Goa actually has a very strong link to Antarctica because I share the same postcode as a place in Antarctica where the Indian station is based. It's the same postcode, and because the Polar Research Institute is based in Goa, so all the mail for Antarctica comes here first, and then it's sent there.
Wow. Another kind of strange connection, but yeah, I see that we're at time. I don't know if anybody had any final comments that or you wanted to make. Anybody?
Well,
Otherwise,
thank you so much again. Yeah, thank you so much again for sharing all this research and your practices. It's been really fascinating to learn more about, and we look forward to following where it will go and what kind of more research it will yield in the future.
great. Well, I mean, just thank you to everybody who joined online for your for the opportunity, as I said, to sort of to reflect a little bit collectively on this kind of recent set of experiences, and really appreciate the kind of insights. But and in particular, I'm really eternally grateful to the work of Faiza and Farooq on this project, and I really do. It would be my aspiration that this is something that needs to develop and can develop, and it was really a kind of very first set of first steps in that sort of process, right? For all the reasons that that have been elaborated this evening. So yeah, thank you to everybody for your collective inputs and time.